So you all know I'm an employer, so that's the angle that I'm coming at for this. Can everybody hear me okay? So I'll start my own introduction to the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. Came in 2005 when we started hiring Jamaican workers. The first year we had 10 men from Jamaica work on our farm for the season. And our introduction as a farm to the system was through another farm that had been hiring Jamaican workers for generations of that farm's work. The farmer that we learned about the program from had grown up around these Jamaican workers himself, but had never been to Jamaica and didn't have much of a connection to the people beyond work. So we started, because we were having trouble finding enough people who could work seasonally and stay beyond September. We had always hired a bunch of university students, but as you all know, that means everybody leaves in September and we still have lots of things to do, like we're harvesting broccoli today. We still have kale, chard, carrots, and a lot of roots out in the field. So we started hiring these Jamaican men under the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. Within the first season, I was really curious about the program and where they come from and everything, and so in conversation would ask them about their experience and how it was for them in Canada. And from that very first year, I heard from them stories of other farms where they had not been treated well. And I didn't know what to do with that at the time because I didn't know where those farms were. They refused to name names and refused to actually, come forward with a complaint about any other farm. They just said, "Leave it, miss, leave it. We're not there anymore. As long as you keep hiring us, we're happy." So, and in that first year, they were very reticent a lot of times at first, until they got to know us. And it's taken a lot of years for some of them to open up and really feel comfortable because of experiences that they have had other places. So Janet already talked about the Temporary Foreign Worker Program and as an overall program, but the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program being the one that we're talking about most right now. One of the things there is and the workers in the Hampstead crash were part of the other stream of the program, which is called a low-skilled stream, and that they are under that program they're able to stay in Canada for up to 4 years. I believe actually now the agricultural stream 2 years with a 4-year maximum, which they're hopefully going to be getting rid of. And the differences, in case you're interested, are available online to explain that. Generally speaking, there's the agricultural stream, which is low-skilled or seasonal agricultural worker program. The seasonal agricultural worker program, they're only allowed to be in the country for 8 months. And regardless of when they arrive in the year, they have to leave by December 15th. The point of that is that it is specifically intended to address seasonal work shortages or labor shortages rather than year-round. But one of the problems that we have is that there are farms who could hire locals because they have year-round full-time work, but what they do is rotate through 8 months at a time seasonal agricultural workers. Regardless of the sector or program, all employers are required to meet a list of obligations. When you apply to be able to hire foreign workers, You have to prove that that you can't find anybody locally for it. And then once that application is approved, you have to sign off that you will meet certain conditions. Under the higher skilled occupations, which is not farming, you know, this covers people coming to work at a university for a couple years, or in some other industry with higher education requirements. The conditions are fairly minimal because those workers are considered to be less vulnerable to exploitation. The Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, I don't know how well you can read that, but it's a fairly long list, and it's available online if you're interested in the details of it. But it basically lays out that you are not going to contravene any of the Employment Standards Act, that you are going to pay for their transportation, that you're not going to deduct housing costs, and a variety of other conditions. The problem is when those conditions are not met. So for organizations with more than 10 employees, low-wage foreign workers can make up no more than 10% of the workforce. Transitional measures will apply to employers whose workforces do not comply with this new rule. Employers in the accommodation and food sector, as well as the retail trade sector, will no longer be allowed to apply for LMIAs for jobs in 10 lower skilled occupations, and that's because that was where a lot of human trafficking was happening. Aside from abuses specifically in agriculture, restaurants and other food businesses saw a lot of abuses and human trafficking taking place. They increased the fee to apply as well. So all of these conditions, in an ideal world, looks like this. This is what our goal is on our farm. And we feel like we achieve it most of the time. We're not perfect, you know. Our workers will say that we're the best bosses, and that's really nice to hear. It feels great. But, you know, that doesn't mean we're perfect. And to me, honestly, one of the biggest frustrations I have is that what we are even doing is considered exceptional. So this is just a picture of one of our workers with his family in Jamaica. We go down and visit them and spend time with them in their homes and with their family, get to know them. They're really a lot of fun to be around. They're really great people. And you can see here, as Janet was talking about, the ability to build a house because of the income that they have in this country. One of our guys drives truck, and when he retires, he wants to start up a trucking business. So when we retired one of our trucks, we gave it to him and helped arrange the transport to ship it down to Jamaica. And so that's him with it there in Jamaica. The camaraderie in the fields and after work, you know, we all work a lot of hours. It goes a lot better when we are laughing and telling stories and having fun. And last year we all went bowling together. A lot of guys had never been bowling, but a couple had gone bowling, so they wanted everybody to share in it. So we arranged the local bowling alley. On a night that they weren't open, we just went in with all of our people. So that's what it looks like for an ideal world. But the problem is that is largely left up to the random chance of having an employer that connects with their workers, that understands the culture their workers are coming from, that takes the time to understand their workers' concerns. Employers generally don't start to be employers because they want to employ people. They employ people because they start doing something and then they realize they have to hire people to do what they're doing. So most employers kind of get into a situation of hiring people by accident. It's not an intentional process. It's not a thought-out strategic approach. It's, I have too much work. What am I gonna do? I have to hire people. Okay, so how do I do that? I hire people. All right, now I have to pay, EI on their behalf and get registered and enrolled in all of these programs. And employment law is very complex. It's not straightforward. And when you're a small business, it can be very difficult to want to find the time to slog through all of that complexity of the systems that we have. And that's not an excuse. But there are employers who aren't treating their Canadian employees right either. The difference is that each one of you, assuming that you're all, there may be some students from outside of the country that are here on a student visa, but for anyone who is a permanent resident or citizen of Canada, if you are unhappy with your employer, you have the choice of walking out the door. You also typically know that there is some route for a grievance, whether it is with a union or with the Ministry of Labor. These people either don't know or are disenfranchised by the system because, as Janet mentioned, when an employee on the seasonal agricultural worker program causes too many issues, the employer can just say, I'm sending you home. That's it. And if they move fast enough and send the worker home fast enough, there's no recourse. That employee is finished. Employers do have to meet the Employment Standards Act. The Ministry of Labor does have jurisdiction now on farms. The RCMP are responsible for enforcing the human trafficking legislation, and there's also the Human Rights Tribunal. All of these things are available in theory to the workers. The liaison service for the Jamaican farm workers, there are various liaison type services from other countries and governments from the countries of origin. Activist groups like Justitia, or Justice for Migrant Workers, can't say enough good about the work that they're doing. Just recently I met a worker who was injured, and his employer wanted to repatriate him rather than getting him treatment here. He was picking apples in the rain, climbing up a ladder, which in the pouring rain is very clearly not a safe thing to do. He slipped off the ladder, fell, and injured his back. His employer didn't take him to get treatment for hours. When he did finally get to a doctor, the doctor said, he'll be fine, but he needs to be on modified duty, he needs to rest, he needs to have some physio, maybe, and, it'll be a couple weeks before he can work to his full usual potential. The employer tried to send him home. Justice for Migrant Workers had a flyer around that area. The worker had seen the flyer. He was not very happy about being sent home and being denied treatment, so he thought, well, I'm going to call these people and see if they can help. And they did. They picked him up at the airport instead of him getting on the plane, and he's gotten the treatment that he needed. But the employer tried to call the police and tried to have him forcibly deported. it shouldn't happen. You know, when someone gets sick, when someone gets injured, it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that they get the treatment they need. If Justice for Migrant Workers hadn't been there, he would have gone home and he would have never been able to return, most likely. Excuse me, sorry. Factors that contribute to vulnerability. The temporary foreign workers are coming from countries where often they don't trust enforcement agencies. You know, they have a lack of confidence in the enforcement because they perceive it perhaps to be corrupt. They often have a negative perception of police. Speaking, you know, specifically in my experience in Jamaica, I know that their perception of the police in Jamaica, and with reason, is that only about 50% of the time do they actually get good service from the police in Jamaica. If one of our guys had a car accident on his way home from visiting us when we were on the island, and the woman that hit him had a friend who was a police officer. So by the time he got out of the car, she had called her friend who was a police officer, and she told our friend that the police were on their way. And he thought, oh, okay, that was fast. The guy showed up and tried to basically turn it around that it was his fault and not the woman's fault. And that police officer had no business even being involved because he wasn't in a traffic division. Long story short, he kind of figured out that something wasn't going right, and he stopped interacting and went to the police himself and eventually got justice. But had he not questioned it, and so this is the kind of atmosphere that they're coming from, and you know, so they don't trust the police here either. Their temporary status makes them, as I've said and Janet said, extremely vulnerable. I'm going to try and hurry up here. Sorry, I'm not sure where I'm at on my time, but I want to leave lots of time for discussion and questions. There are a whole lot of things that could make the program better. You know, over the years, I've thought about it a lot, talked with the workers, and ultimately the single most effective way to empower workers is to offer them permanent status. Remove the ability of the employer to repatriate them unilaterally. Whatever that looks like, you know, the argument I've heard from employers is that if they are given status right away, then they won't want to work on the farm. They'll leave for a higher paying job. Short term, speaking as an employer, short term, that's going to be a problem. It's going to be hard to deal with. But if we cannot, as employers, offer our workers fair compensation and a positive enough work environment that they want to stay, then we have a big problem. And I will say that for myself, I believe that it's possible. I know that it's possible to have a just system where we pay people a reasonable wage and treat them well enough that they can live on what we pay them and that they are happy enough to stay. I have one example of that specifically. A friend of mine outside of the seasonal agricultural worker program, met her in Jamaica. She came to Canada. I have permission to tell her story. She came to Canada to work in a restaurant. The employer was pretty awful. He tried to pressure her into sexual favors. He didn't pay. He wasn't paying his workers. So, you know, the first phone call from her when she arrived in Canada was, "Yay, I'm in Canada." The next one was, "Is this normal?" And then the subsequent phone calls became more panicked and more concerned. And after 2 weeks, my husband and I drove to where she was living. And please, I don't recommend doing this because it's dangerous, but we didn't think about it. We just did it. And we snuck her out of there and then called the police. And then the police said, "Why in the hell did you do that?" The employer was then charged with human trafficking. Eventually, I'll make a really long story, complicated story short, 8 counts of human trafficking. The problem is that even when you get a charge, you don't necessarily see justice. He pled to very minor paperwork offense, which meant that the victims, the human trafficking victims of his crime, were no longer legally considered to be the victims. They were not allowed to speak at his sentencing. And he was allowed lots of time to cry and produce an incredibly shocking story that still blows my mind to the judge. And the judge deemed that he had, in her words, suffered enough and discharged him completely. So even when victims do come forward, and she was subjected to threats, and her family was threatened, even when they do come forward and they're willing to stick it out and go through that incredibly difficult process, we don't have enough enforcement in this country. They're working, she and her husband are working on my farm. They have permanent residency status now, and they've chosen to stay working on our farm. So to me, that's my silver lining of that story. Just in case we're forgetting, this is about people. People who want a better life, people who want to afford schooling for their families, and in the context of an unfair system globally, we in this country only have the status we do, the high expectation of having stuff, because people in the global south continue to be disadvantaged. So just a couple of questions to leave you with.
Super. Thank you.